Hey guys, Shouldoj here. Today we are looking at a few of the TalonGames mouse pads, including the Maboroshi, the Raku, the Shou, and the Shibu. TalonGames is a gaming peripheral brand that sells a wide variety of products, including grips for mice and controllers, mouse skates, as well as mouse pads, of which we will be looking at some of today. TalonGames created their first mouse pad in September of 2024 and kept making mouse pads from then until today, including one released in late October this year, which we won't be looking at today, but maybe in another video. The four pads we're looking at today will include the Maboroshi, Raku, Shou, and Shibu. The Maboroshi is supposed to be a medium to high speed, slightly textured surface. The Raku a more balanced and fuzzier skin-friendly option from the prior. The Shou a more fine vertical weaves control surface, and the Shibu a high control ultra fine soft surface. I bought all of these pads from the official TalonGames store on AliExpress, all in 490 by 420, with the Maboroshi in purple, the Raku in black, the Shou in green, and the Shibu in gray. With all that being said, let's move on to the surface of the Maboroshi. Looking at a macro shot, the Maboroshi features a very tight and chaotic surface weave that almost looks like it was heat pressed. There isn't any fraying, nor are there looser threads in the weave. It is also worth mentioning at this time that I do believe this surface is coated, as it not only promotes its waterproof surface in its description, but it certainly has the feeling of a coated surface. As I mentioned earlier, with the heat pressed feel of the surface, there is an underlying texture, but it feels very artificial, almost like there's more of a glass texture than a cloth texture. It feels somewhere between the level of texture of the La Onda Blitz and Matrova Vein, with a texture that I feel wouldn't create any skin irritation for most people. I would say the surface that I could compare most to the Maboroshi would be the LGG Hyperion. Despite its very different surface weave, the overall feel and properties of these two pads are very similar to one another. On a texture level, the Hyperion does feel a bit fuzzier and consistent than the Maboroshi, as well as having a less cool feeling to it. Also, the Hyperion is a tiny bit quicker than the Maboroshi, at least in terms of stag friction. But overall, if you like the Hyperion and want something a bit different, this could be the next pad for you. Moving on to the surface properties, the static and dynamic friction of this surface are very low and balanced with one another, though if I were to go out on a limb, I would say the static friction feels a bit stronger than the dynamic friction, as the surface feels very slidey and I do find myself having micro stutters when tracking if I'm pressing down. Despite the surface indeed having a feelable texture, it's not quite a texture that I can easily stop on, as it almost feels smooth in the way a cotton shirt feels smooth. I would suspect the lack of stopping power on this surface to come from the heat pressed surface feel that I mentioned earlier most of all, as it doesn't feel like the texture can be enhanced at all when pressing down on it. I would say the quickness of the surface is balanced between the X and Y axis. However, the texture of the Y-axis is a bit more grainy than the X-axis, which could make it feel a bit slower as well, though only when pressing down hard enough. The Maboroshi has felt very humidity resistant during the time that I tested it, as I never felt like it became slower under hotter or more humid temperatures. In addition, it has a very good sweat resistance, as not only is it very waterproof due to what I believe to be its coating, but it also disperses sweat very well for the sweat that does get absorbed by the pad. The Maboroshi is not sleeve friendly, as it doesn't work well enough with any of my sleeves to consider use with them, and it's not the worst sleeveless experience, but the surface definitely leaves me desiring more in that regard. The surface debris brushes off fairly easily, but for the debris that doesn't brush off so easily, it is very easy to feel beneath your palm and fingers when sliding, being downright annoying at times. I feel like I have to brush off the surface of the Maboroshi every couple minutes sometimes. And here's an audio clip with my G Pro Superlight 2 with Obsidian Air dot skates to show what that texture can sound like. Now, moving on to the Raku, looking at a macro shot, the Raku's surface weave is fairly tight and follows a consistent pattern, similar to the QCK or Gigantus version 2. There isn't any fraying to be seen amongst the threading. The Raku feeling-wise reminds me more of the latter of which, with the surface having a very light but defined microtexture, one that has quite the strong frictional influence on the skin, so you have to be in control of how hard you're pressing. The Raku does share nearly identical properties and overall feel to another surface which you've probably heard of, being the LGG Saturn Pro. The surface of the Raku in Saturn Pro have nearly identical frictional values as far as I can tell. And with the LGG soft style base, the amount you can press in is consistent with the Raku as well. The only difference I could find between these two pads is the Saturn Pro has a slightly more defined and raised texture, one that you can subconsciously feel more easily than with the Raku. Moving on to the surface properties of the Raku, the surface of the Raku does have a nicely low static friction, similar to the way the Artisan Zero does with the texture that you can hone to your advantage, though the Raku surface is a bit more sticky rather than relying on its texture for stopping power. The dynamic friction isn't that much stronger than the static friction, at least not to the point where it became an issue, as I felt pretty good playing RoboQuest on this pad. As I mentioned earlier, the frictional properties of this pad do sort of remind me of the Zero in a way, with a surface that relies on honing the amount you press into the pad to increase the stopping power with its texture. Unlike the Zero, the texture is much more on the micro and smooth textured side of things, which results in a surface that feels more artificial, as if there's some sort of constant gluey substance sticking to your hand, which amplifies when you sweat, but this can be negated by lifting your fingers up from the surface. There is certainly a difference in the X and Y axis, as not only does the Y axis feel more textured than the X axis, but also feels a good amount slower than the X axis. I would say the surface has handled humidity very well, as it seems to be able to disperse moisture well. On the other hand, with its sweat resistance, it's less of a matter of its moisture dispersal, and more so the heat-pressed feel of the surface, which results in a surface that feels stickier when you begin to sweat. I would consider the Raku to have a sleeve-friendly surface, as it works at least decently well with most of my sleeves, except for the wallhack sleeve, which is to no surprise, and works excellently with my Gamersupps sleeve. I don't feel too bothered by debris on the surface, and I don't have too many issues with brushing debris off the surface of this pad, and this pad doesn't seem to have any overwhelming issues with hair getting stuck to it either. And here's an audio test with my G Pro Superlight with Obsidian Air dot skates to show what that texture can sound like. Now, moving on to the Shou, looking at a macro shot, the surface weave of the Shou looks very similar to the weave of the Artisan Type 99, though the Shou's surface does seem a bit less dense and more tight than the Type 99. There isn't much fraying with the surface weave, but there are some looser threads poking out, which I believe to contribute to a slightly more level and fuzzier feeling. The Shou also feels very similar to the Type 99, with a drag feel when moving across the X-axis that may be unpleasant to some. It feels very control-oriented, and despite this drag I mentioned earlier, I would still very much call it skin-friendly, and this is honestly one of the better Type 99 clone implementations that I've seen. Seeing that the Shou and Type 99 have the exact same surface weave, it would only be appropriate to compare them with one another, but there are some minor differences in the two that are worth noting. First off, while the feel of these two pads are very similar, I would say that Type 99 has a more differential in the X and Y axis in terms of texture than the Shou, but the Shou does feel like a more controlled version of the Type 99 overall, but this could be different from case to case depending on what base you have. As for the Type 99, I have mine in the mid base. Overall, though, I would say if you're looking for a more budget alternative to the Type 99, the Shou would not be a bad option if you're willing to accept its trade-offs to the Type 99. Moving on to the surface properties of the Shou, the surface of the Shou is certainly static focused, as its static friction is much stronger than its dynamic, making it ideal for flicking scenarios while still being able to track, but it may struggle on vertical movement due to its vertical surface weave. The stopping power is very strong on this surface due to its horizontal weave, which allows you to stop on a dime for most movements except for vertical movements, which happens to be much less often than horizontal movements. Unlike other cheap Type 99 clones, I do feel like the Shou is much less annoying in the way that it doesn't grab or hook onto the skin, but rather you're able to hone this property to your advantage. As I've already referenced many times, the vertical surface weave leads to a big disparity in movements between the X and Y axis, with the X-axis feeling much more controlled than the Y-axis, though I would say the texture, without applying any pressure, does feel very identical between the axes. Luckily for those who may be in humid environments, the surface weave that the Shou uses isn't too strongly affected by higher humidities and handles it well. On the other hand, I cannot promise consistent performance for users with especially sweaty hands, as the pad will start to catch more on your hand, and especially with your fingers the more you sweat. Similar to the Type 99, the Shou is sleeve usable in the way that it needs a very specific type of sleeve to work with it. Specifically, the Kibu and Unusual Sway Sports sleeve work okay with it, but the TBTL sleeve is the real standout from the bunch that I have. The surface of the Shou is honestly very easy to keep clean, as it doesn't seem to have any issues with static electricity buildup, and most debris brushes off very easily, and I don't find myself bothered by debris between my skin and the surface too often. And here's an audio test with my GPX Superlight with Obsidian Air dot skates to show what that texture can sound like. Now last we have the Shibu, and looking at a macro shot, the weave is a bit more on the loose side, but it is consistent in following a pattern, though there is some fraying amongst the threads. The surface of this pad feels very soft and is certainly in what I would regard as mud territory, and while it isn't the worst mud experience, it certainly doesn't come close to the same level as quality as the Jupiter Pro for me. There is a light texture to the surface, but not one that feels any abrasive. The pad that I think would be most worth comparing to the Shibu would be the LGG Jupiter Pro. While I would consider both of these surfaces to qualify as mud pads, I would say the Jupiter Pro is a good amount slower overall than the Shibu, not having a specific frictional value decrease, but just an overall decrease. The Jupiter Pro does feel a bit more comfortable to use than the Shibu, as I feel a bit more skin to surface contact on the Shibu than the Jupiter Pro, but besides that small factor, these two pads have a very similar surface and texture feel, and are very smooth. I will say the static frictional values of these surfaces do feel stronger than the dynamic frictional values, as I feel this surface is meant for start and stop movements rather than dynamic tracking scenarios. With the mid base of this pad, the stopping power isn't minuscule, but it's a bit harder to get any variation in how quickly you're able to stop by pressing down onto the surface. Stopping definitely has to be done with intention on this surface, and I wouldn't recommend it for beginners because of this property, the same way you wouldn't recommend a firm base to a beginner. There isn't too much of a difference in speed between the X and Y axis on the Shibu, but I do feel the Y axis is a bit more textured than the X axis, as that fuzzy feel which I mentioned with this surface is much more feelable on the Y axis. The humidity and sweat resistance is not anything to gawk at, and in fact is quite disappointing as it takes way too long for moisture to dissipate on the surface, and the fuzzy texture of this pad doesn't make for any strong humidity resistance either. I would not call the Shibu sleeve friendly, despite its smooth surface, and in fact I would call it unfriendly, as it doesn't work well enough with any of my sleeves to consider use with them, as the soft fuzzy feel of this surface contributes to a higher friction which pulls against any of the sleeves I use. If you've paid any attention to my face cam, you may have noticed my luscious locks, and I will mention that this pad does get hair caught in its surface incredibly easily, and it does take some effort to get those hairs off the surface. Not only hair, but smaller debris is very hard to brush off, and it constantly feels like there's something on the surface of this pad. I don't hate mud pads by any means, as the Jupiter Pro is actually one of my favorite pads, but the fuzzy textured pads is not the way to approach a muddy feel in my opinion. And here's an audio test with my GPX Superlight with Obsidian Air dot skates to show what this texture can sound like. Now, moving on to the properties of the bases, starting with the soft base, which is the base found on the Maboroshi, Raku, and Shou, which I have here. It consists of a rubber material, and as the name suggests, sits somewhere in soft firmness territory. The soft base does seem to have some sort of minor non-slip coating, but it doesn't help its case all that much in terms of adherence, and isn't sticky by any means. Both the Maboroshi and Raku measured at 4.7 and 4.5 millimeters respectively when measuring the entire thickness of these pads with digital calipers, and the Shou also sat at 4.5 millimeters thickness. The soft base is fairly plush, as it feels pretty easy to sink into, but isn't unintentional by any means, as it is worth noting that the Maboroshi will feel more on the firm side due to its tighter surface weave. Overall, I would say the TalonGames soft style bases are slightly more firm than an Artisan soft style base, but nowhere near their mid bases. The adherence to the desk on the soft bases aren't strong in any regard, but not too useless, as I do feel it slide around when I press my hand in and really try to nudge it, but nothing too serious when I'm actually playing in game. As I stated earlier, the elasticity of the base is much more on the plush side when you're pressing in, as it doesn't take too much effort to press into. The rebound is fairly springy and quite strong coming back up, which is to be expected of a rubber base. All of this making for a surface which feels well enough with dot skates to the point where I wouldn't have too much concern unless you're using a ridiculously low number of skates on a larger mouse. Now, moving on to the mid base. The mid base is the base which you'll find on the Shibu and consists of a rubber material, and as the name suggests, sits somewhere in mid-firmness territory. Similar to the soft base, the mid base does seem to have signs of a minor non-slip coating on its rubber base, but it doesn't make it sticky by any means. The thickness of the Shibu with its mid base measured in at 3.8 millimeters thick when measuring the entire thickness of the pad with digital calipers, very different from what we saw with the soft bases. The mid base that the Shibu features does indeed feel like a true mid, as it's very hard to subconsciously press into and feels like you have to put in a pretty decent amount of effort before you begin to sink in. Overall, I would say TalonGames mid-style bases fall somewhere between a bit more plush than Artisan's mid-style bases, sitting somewhere between that and LGG's soft-style bases. The adherence to dusk certainly isn't as good on the mid base as the other soft bases, but I imagine it won't slide around an obnoxious amount during play unless you play very tense. I don't see the adherence getting any worse over time on the bright side. As I stated earlier, you certainly wouldn't be pressing down on this base subconsciously, and the rebound is very fast and strong coming back up. The elasticity when pressing down is a bit more focused rather than spread out, which is to be expected of a mid-style base. I think dot skates go excellently with this base, as you won't have to worry about pressing down too hard at any point. Now, moving on to the stitching, the edge stitching pattern is similar to the one that Matrova follows, with little dots of thread lining across the bottom side, and while the stitching remains visible on the top. The stitching does feel and look more separate from the rest of the base, but it doesn't start to mesh when looking from the bottom, as the stitching doesn't entirely wrap around the edges. The stitching is a surprising amount softer than the rest of the base, and does settle out nicely when pressing down on both from the surface. The stitching does seem to meet at the same level or slightly below the surface for all of the pads featuring the soft base, but for the Shibu that features the mid base, the stitching falls just a bit above the rest of the surface. Moving on to quality, the Maboroshi is the only surface of the pads we reviewed today that has a coating, but TalonGames has specified that it is a very thin coating, so I don't believe there's much concern for the pad becoming entirely different over time. The other surfaces that don't have a coating don't feel any different from when I first got them either. The surfaces feel consistent on all of the pads, and I don't feel there are any changes in speed for any of them. I didn't get one of the art printed surfaces, as I'm not a fan of the TalonGames art style, so I can't say much on the sharpness of the printing, but the implementation quality feels fairly natural overall. But I will say the Maboroshi does feel like the heat pressing process might have been a bit much with it. I would say the speed ratings for all the pads make sense, as they do rank them in quickness exactly as I have them ranked in my mind, and the texture descriptions are accurate. There is a logo in the top left corner of each of the pads, which, while it wouldn't be my first choice in terms of location, as I would much rather prefer it on the bottom right, and while it is also raised, it is quite small, so you will feel it when gliding over it, but you're going to be getting pretty close to the edge anyway before it ever sticks out. The surface weave alignment on all of these surfaces is very good, as I don't see any noticeable skews from a first glance, only being able to see the slightest deviation when looking at through my macro cam. Now, moving on to the quality of the bases, the Shibu that features the mid base does have some very noticeable bumps, especially near the top of the pad on my copy, and does certainly downgrade the experience of the Shibu. The soft bases do have this issue as well, but not nearly to the same level as does mid bases, and is more noticeable with the Shou, and hardly noticeable, if not invisible, with the Maboroshi, which makes sense with its tighter surface weave. The dimensions of each of the pads when measured do indeed come out to the 490 by 420 millimeters listed in the product descriptions. The base does feel the same plushness despite the bumpiness of these pads I mentioned earlier, as I believe these bumps are more so changes in height rather than any changes in density of the base. Now, looking at the quality of the stitching, this distance from stitch to stitch is very even all the way around the pad. However, there are some places where the depth of the stitching seems to be a bit off, but nothing that you can easily see or be able to impact your performance. The stitching meets near the bottom right corner for all four pads and doesn't cover too much distance, while not having too much of a contrast in plushness compared to the rest of the edges. There is some bleeding out of color, which I can notice on the Maboroshi, which tells me that the coloring process was done all together and must have been very light. There is a bit of fuzziness to the edge stitching, which, looking at it closely when I scratch the edges, I do see strands come up, which raises some question for the longevity of this edge stitching. Moving on to customer experience, the customer service is fairly good, as the TalonGames Discord was quick to serve and answer my questions that I had about their products. However, I tried to send a message through their website support, and I still have yet to receive a response on the ends of that. So if you have questions, I would advise you to take it to their Discord server. And while I can't say the community itself is active, TalonGames has put a lot of effort as of recently to jumpstart their Discord server and Twitter accounts again, which could be a sign of bigger things in the future for them, or they just realized how many people are truly interested in their products. The purchasing experience was fairly easy on AliExpress, which at the time of making is one of the places you can find TalonGames, as well as Amazon. When I purchased these pads from AliExpress, it took 8 days from the time of purchase for them to arrive at my door, which is very quick for AliExpress standards. Moving on to price, using coupons and other discounts, I managed to get these pads at just about $20 per pad, but if not discounted or using any other cashbacks, these pads will run you about $30 each. Each pad is packaged rolled up fairly tight in a pretty cool silver box, which if you do order from AliExpress at least will be packaged inside of another box, so I certainly don't have any concerns for them getting dented on the way. None of the pads come with any extra accessories, and I would say some of these pads are more worth the price than others, specifically being the Raku and Shou, if you can get a good discount on them, as these pads really need a polyurethane base, which I believe would help greatly with the bumps in the surface and lack of adherence, which at the time of this video, TalonGames said that they may or may not have plans to add pro versions to their lineup, but it could be with a different name. I would recommend the Maboroshi to someone who wants a smooth, micro-textured, balanced speed surface, and the Raku to someone who wants a more skin-friendly alternative to the Zero. I would recommend the Shou to someone who wants a more budget alternative to the Type 99 without having that budget clone feel. On the other hand, I'm not sure I can recommend the Shibu to anyone, as the Shibu feels way too inconsistent and suffers from that bumpiness that I mentioned throughout this video. I would rate these pads as follows, with the Maboroshi being a 79 out of 100, the Raku being an 81 out of 100, the Shou being an 83 out of 100, and the Shibu being a 56 out of 100. I definitely look forward to what TalonGames has coming out going forward, and may certainly buy more of their products if they start to implement new bases for their cloth series and start using less suggestive art, or at least make more moderate versions of these pads. With all that being said, thank you for watching. Bye bye.